from whom the title of this talk comes. He wrote in the 1890s that a librarian often wonders that a student can go through a 4 years course without really becoming proficient in the use of books, without learning that it's not always the reading of books that most enriches, but the skillful glancing at them. Then there's the waste of time and energy in rediscovering what is already known. The wise student looks for the blazed pathways of those who have gone before him. As Justin Windsor suggests, I wanted to look at the blazed pathways of the instructional librarians who've preceded us, particularly those who were working in the 19th century, which was an interesting period and a time of substantial change in higher education. But before I go along too far, I do want to know a little bit about our audience today. Before I ask you about yourselves, just to mention a little bit more about me, and thank you, Sean, for that very gracious introduction. I am a reference and instruction librarian. Essentially, I also work on electronic resources. I'm at a very small school, Holy Names University in Oakland, California, and like many librarians at small schools, I've got a pretty wide range of responsibilities. As we're sponsored today by ALISE, there may be some people on the call who are not ALISE members, so if you're not familiar with the organization, it's the Association of Library and Information Science Educators, people who are involved in LIS instruction and teaching. And I'm very excited to be speaking to those who are involved in LIS education. My perspective is that of a practitioner. Most of the instruction that I do is for undergraduates and master's level students, not in library science, but in different fields, nursing and education and so on. If perhaps either through the chat window or in other ways, people could indicate, I'm curious, what roles they hold. Those of you who who are practitioners as librarians or have been in the past, do you work in or have worked in public libraries or academic libraries? If you work exclusively as faculty in LIS education, so if people could throw in what kind of backgrounds they have. Anyone? As I expected, a pretty significant variety, which is great. As I said, I'm going to be speaking primarily from the perspective of an instructional librarian at a four-year university, and most of my examples relate to that, especially since I'm talking about the ACRL standards for information literacy, which is geared primarily towards undergraduate education. But I think that these kind of questions and these issues and the current debate is really relevant to everybody who's working in the library science field, whether it's as a educator, as a librarian, public, private, because the whole idea around information literacy instruction really revolves around the idea of making sure that our users, our patrons, people who are utilizing the library are using it to the maximum, to their maximum benefit, that they have the tools and the skills and the knowledge and understanding that they need to take advantage of the resources that are available to them, and I feel like that's relevant to everyone. Thank you to ALISE for reaching out to me, Sean Burns and Susan and Alicia, who's been helping arrange this webinar, for making it happen. I also wanted to acknowledge my own LIS education, since we have educators here. I graduated from San Jose State School of Library and Information Science in 2009, and I specifically want to acknowledge that my interest in library history, and particularly 19th century library history, is really attributed directly to the wonderful professor at San Jose State, Dr. Deborah Hansen. I took multiple courses with her on the history of libraries and historical research methods, and I think she's just a wonderful teacher. And I learned a lot from her and gained a lot of inspiration, and that has a lot to do with why I'm interested in this subject. And Dr. Hansen had a really strong profound effect on me as a practitioner. To go forward, as many of you know, the Association for College and Research Libraries, or ACRL, is currently in the process of redefining information literacy and issuing a new framework for information literacy instruction in higher education, with the idea that this new framework would supplant the ACRL standards for information literacy instruction in higher education that was initially approved 15 years ago. I want to start with a bit of context about higher education. Across the country, the focus of student study is really shifting into a lot of new fields, away from many traditional university curriculums, gearing more towards sciences, engineering, business. More students than ever are going to college. Many are the first in their families to attend college, and the student body is far more diverse than it used to be. New teaching methods are being explored, and instructors are trying to find new ways to connect and engage with students in the classroom. And as technology is changing how information is accessed and disseminated, there's more information available to students than ever before. Of course, I'm not actually talking about 2015. I'm talking about the 1870s and 1880s. Academia went through a massive shift, probably even more dramatic than what's being experienced now. The entire modern system of elective courses was born in this period. It allowed students to self-direct their course of study for the first time, and public and land-grant institutions were being founded, and that started to change how higher education was practiced, and it opened doors to a whole new generation of college students. It really changed who attended college in the United States and really changed how college was perceived. And libraries shifted along with all of those other changes in higher education. Up until that point, librarians had usually been a retired university professor or a historian or professor of literature. They'd be working part-time in the library. They wouldn't have any staff. Libraries had very small collections. Books were viewed as being highly valuable. They were contained in small spaces in other academic buildings, and student access was either limited or non-existent. And stacks were closed, and books could not leave the library. And I see a comment from Karen that this was more true for men in the 1870s, and that's absolutely the case. That was something I was going to acknowledge later. Although the 1870s saw a change in the number of people who were allowed to go to college, it was still very much dominated by men and generally white men across the country. And bringing women into higher education and bringing people of color into higher education was really something that developed later. As I said, I was planning to acknowledge that later, but that is absolutely the case and should be brought up. So one of the changing technologies of the time was how much easier it was to print books. Of course, the printing press way predated this period, but with the changes in technology, they were able to print them on a much larger scale in this period of the 19th century than they had been previously. And one person who commented on that was the Reverend T.K. Davis. He was the librarian at Ohio's College of Wooster, and he commented in 1885, and this, of all the quotes that I'm going to use today, is maybe one of the chewiest. It's a little hard to follow because it's very 19th century, but I kind of love it. The press is teeming with publications on every imaginable subject, and books are now furnished and pressed upon us at a wonderfully reduced cost, and generally of a character greatly superior in every respect to those which were within reach of students in former times. And the finest of the wheat is abundant and cheap. Is it not injustice to earnest students to offer them chaff and straw? And I think we can certainly envy how affordable new materials had gotten during Reverend Davis's time, and for the Worcester Library, we certainly right now are seeing a lot of access to materials becoming more and more expensive as database costs and journal subscription costs continue to rise. But overall, there is more free and open access to information available now through through the web than available ever before in history. And so in many ways it does resemble what Davis witnessed and what he was remarking on, is this boom in information that's becoming available, boom in scholarship that's becoming available. While that information pattern is changing things for us now, it did as well in the 1880s when he was writing. Libraries, because of this boom in publishing, libraries grew rapidly and started requiring their own buildings and a dedicated professional staff. And that mirrored the rapidly expanding American public library movement, which really got moving in this era, and the professionalization of librarianship. And one of the big changes, one of the big trends of the period was where that stacks were opened up to students and books were allowed to circulate, a rather major shift. One of the people that I opened this with a quote from Justin Windsor. He was one of the people who spearheaded that change in philosophy, and he pushed to centralize the importance of the library on the college campus. He wrote that the proposition then is to make the library the grand rendezvous of the college for teacher and pupil alike, and to do it in as much of the teaching as convenient and practical. This cannot be done with a meager collection of books indiscriminately selected, with untidy, ill-lighted, uncomfortable apartment. The library should be to the college much what the dining room is to the house, the place to invigorate the system under cheerful conditions with a generous fare and a good digestion. As I said, many of the colleges and universities in the country were building their first dedicated library buildings in that period, and I do think on a lot of campuses the library was successful in kind of claiming a real stake on the campus in terms of a centralized location. Even on the tiny college where I work, our library is very centrally located right in the middle of the main squad, and having that kind of centrality of place I think was really important to the development of the library and how it's seen on campus. The image here is Sibley Hall. It was the first dedicated library building at the University of Rochester, and I show it because I want to bring up Otis H. Robinson. He was the librarian at the University of Rochester, a contemporary of Windsor's, and he's remembered by library historians primarily for two things. One, that he's the guy who invented that little hole in the catalog card that you run a rod through in order to keep the cards in order. Pretty important. And he was also one of the earliest advocates of librarians leading instruction. In a major 1876 work that he published with the U.S. Department of Education on the state of libraries in the U.S., he contributed an essay arguing for the systematic courses in library use for college students. He acknowledged that librarians did not always have the respect of faculty, were not always seen as one of the principal educators of a college, but he felt that needed to change. Of course, this is a debate that literally continues 125 years later. Some battles don't quite go away, but his advocacy for librarians as instructors did catch momentum, and it had a significant effect in those early years of academic libraries. Robinson was also quoted 4 years later saying that the idea that a college librarian may serve the classes as an instructor quite as successfully as the professor of Latin or of mathematics is beginning to take root. The time is passing also when the chief duty of a librarian was to collect books and preserve them. How to get them used most extensively, most intelligently, and at the same time carefully is becoming his chief concern. So Robinson emphasized the importance of having an attractive, comfortable library and the importance of easy access for students to browse materials themselves. To do otherwise, in his words, would be paving the road to the library and forbidding anyone to travel it. Of course, prior to his generation, that's exactly what the case was for libraries, since they were largely closed to students. He wrote about both instructing students in their classrooms and in the library itself. So Robinson was part of a movement, and librarians as instructors was a growing idea. By the 1892 ALA annual conference, there was a special presentation to the college section, which is the forerunner to the ACRL of today, on teaching bibliography to college students. The speaker was George T. Little of Bowdoin College in Maine, and during the fall semester he was given 1 hour a week to take over a class of English history majors, to whom he provided a series of 24 45-minute lectures covering everything from ancient writing to the invention of printing to the construction of modern books and library classification. every once in a while I ponder the idea of providing 24 45-minute lectures in addition to all my other duties as a librarian, and I get a little terrified. Each lecture was followed by time in the library itself, so the students would come with research prompts based on their coursework in English history, and the students were expected to take notes on all the materials that they consulted, discuss their findings with the librarian, who would then provide feedback and advice. Little was one of a number of early librarians who referred to this kind of guided library research as laboratory work for bibliography. The 1897 conference of the ALA also featured an extended discussion of bibliographic instruction by the college section, and there was some disagreement about methods. One of the people who advocated for this idea of the library lab was Columbia's G.H. Baker, who said that I think the way to teach young men something about bibliography in libraries is not so much by lectures as by what is termed in other sciences laboratory work. Get them to the library and show them the books in the catalog. It is a great deal more practical. So librarians were part of a change in how college education was taught. Many of these early instruction librarians I've cited wrote about two new trends in education, the seminary method of instruction and the topical method of instruction. So nowadays we often associate the word seminary specifically with theological institutions, but these educators were referring to the difference between the seminar course and the lecture course. And this was a new idea in the time that had originated in Germany. Professors were using small rooms in the libraries to foster interactive discussions, partnering with the librarians so that the students could explore the library during their class time. Librarians at Cornell, Harvard, and Johns Hopkins all participated in these seminary methods of instruction. The topical method was designed to give students more freedom of choice. Instead of rote lectures, the professor would discuss an issue and the students were free to explore and research related topics and produce their own research work. So that doesn't sound particularly revolutionary now. Every college student picks topics for research papers and so on. But back then it was a pretty significant change in the academic library, and these library instructors were at the heart of it. I feel like a lot of these early librarians and the methods they practiced are worth looking at today because so many of the elements that they were involved in are still reverberating now, even though we sometimes use different terms. For many instructional librarians, the idea of leading active exercises to engage students in learning is a big deal and something we discuss a lot, which very much is reflected in the idea of the library laboratory that they emphasized in the 1880s. There's a very trendy method called flipped instruction, where you deliver lecture content through readings or video in advance of classes so that students can lead discussion and have exercises during class time, which is harkens back to this seminary method as it was first unveiled. And George Little's series of regular lectures and lab work, where he was part of this course over the course of a semester, is very much like the embedded librarianship that we talk about today. So while a lot of the terms and the language changes over the years, a lot of the same concepts are in place, and we can learn a lot from what people doing this work in the past have done. I think in general, the focus on teaching students how to properly understand materials and use them critically is essentially what we should be doing now, what we often discuss doing. And so again, I think it's worth looking at this history. So I will jump forward a little bit in time now. So some of the early methods that I was talking about flourished up until the First World War. But in the middle of the 20th century, librarian instruction had really receded. It hit a lull. It was largely replaced by the idea of the reference desk, also, of course, an important part of library work. Librarians providing individual one-on-one instruction to students as needed was seen as the way to go, until another growth period in higher education in the 1960s brought the idea of librarian instruction back. The term bibliographic instruction began to be supplanted by the phrase information literacy instruction in the 1970s, and that shift was formalized with the 1989 ALA Presidential Committee on Information Literacy that defined information literacy as the ability to recognize when information is needed and have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the needed information. And that committee was made up with a combination of school, public, and academic librarians. So following in the footsteps of that 1989 Presidential Commission, in 1998, the American Association of School Librarians issued its formal goals for information literacy education in our K through 12 schools, and that was followed in 2000 by ACRL's Information Literacy Standards for Higher Education. Some of you, of course, I'm sure are very familiar with ACRL's standards. Not everyone is, so I'll just go through them quickly. The first standard is that the information literacy student determines the nature and extent of the information needed. The information literate student accesses needed information effectively and efficiently. The student evaluates information and its sources critically and incorporates selected information into his or her knowledge base and value system. Uses information effectively to accomplish a specific purpose. And finally, the fifth standard understands many of the economic, legal, and social issues surrounding the use of information and accesses and uses information ethically and legally. So these ACRL standards became a benchmark used around the country, and they influenced higher ed beyond just libraries, and were adopted by the American Association of College and Universities, the AACU, as their framework, or very similar language, as their framework for information literacy assessment, and became part of college accreditation. So the standards have been very influential. They have also been quite criticized. In my own opinion, they tend to be very binary. The student is or the student is not. And in many cases, this encouraged a rote form of instruction that emphasized the mechanics of information retrieval over the kind of harder to define higher order thinking that it takes for students to have an intrinsic understanding of information use, evaluation, and purpose. So knowing how to use information sources, certainly in my opinion, is more important than knowing where the checkbox is for a peer-reviewed article in a database. And I feel like they had an understanding of that concept long before databases in the 19th century. You know, speaking as an instructional librarian who does a lot of one-shot workshops, I'm asked many times to just demonstrate the databases, or I feel reduced to teaching interfaces and mechanics, and I do think instruction can go beyond that. And Sean, I certainly agree with you that rubrics can put these sorts of things on a continuum, and I've also been involved in that kind of process, and we did, at my institution, we evaluate information use via a rubric that is tied to the ACRL standards. So that is exactly what we do here, and I'm sure many libraries across the country. So to go forward into the new framework. So the ACRL's new framework for information literacy instruction in higher education is officially on its third public draft, although actually the final and fourth draft was let out yesterday, which led to a little bit of scrambling and adjusting by me, since I wanted this to be as current as possible and working with what will be used going forward. So there was a committee, and it was led by Craig Gibson and Trudy Jacobson, trying to synthesize that broad mix of research and practice in library instruction to drive this new framework. I want to make it clear right now, I'm not on that committee, and I certainly don't speak for ACRL as an organization. I'm an outside observer. I have my own perspective as a librarian and an educator. There are things that I like about the new framework. There are questions that I have, I think, like many people do. I know it's become an area of debate, sometimes divisive. I'm trying not to focus on that right now and just looking at it and seeing what connections I can find between history and the present. The goal of the framework, I think, is an attempt to undo some of the limitations of the standards, and it does do away with this kind of statements that start with a declarative, the information literate student is, and goes in a different direction from that. It focuses on this idea of threshold concepts, which some of you may be familiar with or have already been reading about as it's been part of the debate over the last year. But it focuses on these threshold concepts as being central to the mastery of information literacy. The academic idea of threshold concepts was pioneered by educational researchers Jan Meyer and Ray Land, non-librarians, they're educators. The idea is that these thresholds exist across different academic disciplines. This is not an idea specific to information literacy. They represent a key learning experience that opens a new perspective and understanding for the student, and that once a student achieves that understanding, it transforms their understanding of that academic discipline. So Meyer and Land apply the following attributes to a threshold concept. It's transformative, changing the perspective of the learner. It is integrative in that it connects different aspects of the discipline to each other. It is irreversible in that once a student passes that threshold, it's a key understanding that they can't unlearn. And it is troublesome, sometimes difficult to grasp for the outsider. So just some examples of threshold concepts that Meyer and Land use. One idea is the testable hypothesis as a threshold concept for biology. And with the idea that it's easier to understand how biology works as a discipline when you understand the concept of the testable hypothesis. Everything in the biology textbook is a result of that process. The establishing of a hypothesis, testing it, repeating the test, and so on. For accounting, their example is depreciation. In physics, gravity. In literature, it's deconstruction. So for the new framework for information literacy instruction, the ACRL committee wanted to establish what the threshold concepts are for the discipline of information literacy. Use those as the central tenet for information literacy instruction instead of the standards. So let's take a look at what they came up with. I'm going to quote directly, so these won't be my definitions. Oh, they're coming up in the wrong order, so I'll just bring all 6 up. Little slide editing gone awry since they reordered them between 2 of the drafts. The first of the 6 standards is authority is constructed and contextual, and again I'll be quoting their definitions, not my own. Information resources reflect their creators' expertise and credibility and are evaluated based on the information need and the context in which the information will be used. Authority is constructed in that various communities may recognize different types of authority. It is contextual in that the information need may help to determine the level of authority required. The second threshold concept, information creation as a process. Information in any format is produced intentionally to convey a message and is shared via a selected delivery method. The iterative processes of researching, creating, revising, and disseminating information vary, and the resulting product reflects these differences. Information has value. Information possesses several dimensions of value, including as a commodity, as a means of education, as a means to influence, and as a means of negotiating and understanding the world. Legal and socio-economic interests influence information production and dissemination. Research as inquiry. Research is iterative and depends upon asking increasingly complex or new questions whose answers in turn develop additional questions or lines of inquiry in any field. Scholarship as conversation. Communities of scholars, researchers, or professionals engaged in sustained discourse with new insights and discoveries occurring over time as a result of varied perspectives and interpretations. And searching is strategic exploration. Searching for information is often nonlinear and iterative, requiring the evaluation of a broad range of information sources and the mental flexibility to pursue alternate avenues as new understanding is developed. So those are the 6 threshold concepts. These are the definitions as they appear in the 4th version, which became available yesterday. So if you've seen previous drafts, you may have seen slightly different definitions or terminology. That's what I'm using. In terms of threshold concepts as a theory, I've seen some pretty persuasive and informative presentations on the threshold concepts from some of the librarian innovators who've brought this topic to the mainstream. I've also read some very cogent and thoughtful criticisms. I think both sides of this debate are worth looking into, and there's legitimate questions about the validity of Meyer and Land's threshold concept theory, and legitimate questions as to whether and how they can apply to our field. I think all of that debate is pretty interesting, and I encourage everybody to pursue it and see what their own perspective is. But again, that's not what this presentation is about, so I'm not going to get too much into criticizing or so on. What I want to do, since I've already kind of gone over some of that early history of librarian instruction in higher education, is take a look at these 6 standards and see if I can find some sources that feel like they relate back to this. The idea, if these special concepts really are this universal aspect of information use, information literacy, that they should be reflected in all the different time periods regardless of technology. And so I wanted to see if there was that kind of evidence in the past, and I think I have found some interesting things to go along with each of these. So I will move forward into that. For the first of the 6 threshold concepts, I want to point to E.H. Woodruff in 1886. So E.H. Woodruff was a librarian at Cornell, and he wrote that the student has been led to look upon his professors and textbooks as the final authorities in their own departments. He has not learned to distinguish and question in a deferential way even those things about which the judgment of youth is apt to be quite as correct as the experience of age. It should be revealed to the student the fact that no textbook or professor's word is final. So what Woodruff is arguing is that students need to understand how information changes over time. He goes on at more length than this in his original essay, and how there's no one set of facts for any particular academic discipline, that things tend to change, and that they need to keep themselves up to date even after they've graduated and they've gone out into the world. And he wrote pretty passionately about how understanding to use libraries is one of the university's most important lessons, because those graduates know how to stay on top of the changing world. And he also refers to the expansion of public libraries in the time as something that they would continue to have access to information even after they graduate from school. Anybody who wants to read the complete work, he was writing this in the 1886 Library Journal, which was at the time the mouthpiece of the ALA, not the kind of professional magazine that it is today. So that's authority is constructed and contextual. For information creation as a process, C.E. Lowry in 1894, library work dispels in the student the notion that books must be read verbatim, after the popular misconception, in order to fulfill their purpose. Books never intended to be read except on special occasion comprise a large part of the university library. The uniformly successful lawyer always has access to reports, and his success is not that he has read all reports, but quite the contrary, that he knows where to find and use a few that suit his purpose. And similarly, the student with reference books. With large representation on every subject, he judges all books by an examination of the character of the treatment of test principles and of problems. And I think this gets into what ACRL was aiming for with the threshold concept of information creation as a process. There's so many different forms and formats of information, different ways that information is constructed, and what its intention is between your scholarly articles, your reference materials. And while to the experienced librarian, the differences between these different information types, whether they're online or in print, may be obvious, it's not always true, especially for undergraduates. And Lowry is referring to how the student should understand what types of materials they need for the different needs that they have, how to use them quickly and efficiently. And I think that really mirrors what they're talking about now with this idea that if you understand the intent of the creator, you understand the standards of that format, and again, whether they're print or online, you'll have a better, the student will have a better chance of finding what they need quickly and effectively. For information has value. Otis Robinson, who I quoted earlier, wrote that we've often seen books worth $50 or $100 taken down from the shelves, turned over for half an hour and put up again with no more care than would be given to those which could be replaced for 50 cents. It has cost us a shudder, but then we have remembered that those costly books were here to be used. Of course, $50 or $100 in 1880 was probably a pretty expensive book. And unfortunately, that's often pretty standard now for a monograph. But the idea, and again, it was a rather revolutionary idea in the 1870s, 1880s to give students free access to the book stacks, allow them to browse for themselves, find things for themselves, and have access to things, have the ability to circulate books, take books home. was all pretty new development in libraries. And Otis Robinson is tapping into a debate here. I've also seen passages from other librarians arguing against these open stacks. But I think that it really relates to what we see now with this idea that information has value and what that value is. I think the debate around, and this has actually been interesting between the different drafts of the ACRL new framework. I remember the second draft, information has value definition, to the third, there was a pretty substantial change that I thought was a significant improvement. But you know, what is the value of information, and how does that reflect through the way that it gets used? And this covers issues like copyright and fair use, the students' access to information, the public's access to information, information privilege. A lot of things come around this information has value, and you know, now it can sound a little hokey, this question, well, should stacks be open or stacks be closed? But it is pretty relevant because of all the things that it represents. It represents how students are being given more freedom, how people can be given the access to information directly instead of a gatekeeper librarian role. And I think those are all pretty important trends, and I think was one of the better accomplishments of these early librarians was to open their libraries up. And so the library no longer became in essence archival institutions just designed to protect these materials, but rather make sure that these materials got used. And of course, as an instructional librarian, I see that as being a big part of my goals and my responsibilities when working with students. Is I'm trying to teach them how to use this information effectively so they can get what they want out of it, and that I think is a reflection of its value. And these things are all connected. To move forward, and I go to Robinson again. I guess I may overuse him a little bit, but he really was an interesting figure. He wrote, who discovered the principles or devised the instruments or held the opinions set forth in the textbooks? Who opposed these opinions? What instruments were formerly used instead of these? Send the students to the library with these questions and others like them, and let them bring the answers into the classroom. All sorts of mistakes will be made at first. So much the more need of continued effort. Point out the mistakes and send them back to the library. So with the threshold concept research as inquiry, ACRL is trying to emphasize the iterative process of research, how constant repeated nature of search and inquiry is required for the student to be successful. The very simple notion that you're not going to just enter one little set of search terms, find all the materials you want, be done, move on from your research, which of course many students want it to be. It doesn't really work that way, I think, as experienced researchers understand. That really it requires this kind of constant going back and continued inquiry. And as Robinson says, all sorts of mistakes will be made at first. But that just points out that need for continued effort. And the students who kind of keep at it and keep working, keep returning to their inquiry, will tend to have more success. So again, I think that what Robinson was talking about in 1881 really relates to this 2014-2015 notion of research as inquiry. For scholarship as conversation, I want to point back to where I started this talk with Justin Windsor and the blazed pathways that gone before him. And this was actually the quote that inspired this entire presentation, this line of inquiry of my own. I first saw this referenced in a really great article in Library Instruction History from the 1980s, and it was quoted directly. And I felt when I read that article, it was around the same time that the first draft was published with the threshold concept scholarship is a conversation, which is now morphed into scholarship as conversation. And it immediately, I made the connection in my mind. What students will hopefully come to understand through good instruction, through their college education, through working with librarians, that every piece of scholarship, whether it's their undergraduate student paper or articles published in journal, none of these things are done in a vacuum. They're all part of this ongoing conversation, from things like the mechanics of properly formatted citation, which helps point your readers to the past conversation, to the more kind of philosophical elements of this, the student becomes part of the conversation. And as more and more student work becomes online and becomes available through institutional repositories that publish student work, I think this is actually something that's becoming even more important, that the students understand that they're part of this conversation and the importance of it. I think the idea of citations and often get emphasized for kind of ethical reasons and to avoid plagiarism, but really the reason that we have citations in that system in scholarship is to create this continual line of conversation and create the connections between past scholarship and future scholarship, and hopefully students can come to understand that and they'll appreciate citations a little more than they do, which often otherwise just seem like this kind of punitive and time-consuming exercise. And so for the final threshold concept, searching is strategic exploration. This is another one that's gone through a couple different verbiage changes. There was one point it was searching as exploration, and then it was searching as strategic, and now they've just combined the two in the final draft. For this I will quote J.H. Morgan in 1893, who wrote that the best librarian must sacrifice time and ease, must risk student displeasure to win the large results. Instead of answering questions at once, he will ask questions of the student. Work thus outlined does more than give information for present use. It makes the searcher something of a librarian and teaches him to use the educated man's tools. So James Henry Morgan of Dickinson College in Pennsylvania is basically in this outlining the reference desk strategy that we still employ. I certainly consider, and I think my colleagues do as well, that the reference desk is an opportunity for instruction. It's not, well, let's just find this person's answer to their question, but rather let's teach this person how to find the answers to their question. And that's what he's describing here. Give the student the ability to go through the same process that an expert might, and to understand that when they're searching for information, that there's a strategy to employ, that they're going to explore these ideas and find what they're looking for if they are strategic. Before wrapping up, I also want to acknowledge the limitations of the method that I've used here. Now, I realize this is hardly a scientific presentation, and was really just a survey, a conversation starter. But one of the major limitations of this subject, and Karen Weaver pointed this out early, all of my sources for this are essentially white men with varying degrees of facial hair, unfortunately much like myself. This is a very limiting aspect of looking at 19th century librarianship. Not only were the librarians generally white men, the students in all of these colleges and universities were generally white men. So there's a certain privilege involved, and the idea of information access and the value of information is a pretty different picture for somebody who was coming from a background of privilege compared to many modern college students in 2015 who are coming from, I think statistics show, an increasingly diverse set of backgrounds. Well, this depends largely on the institution. Certainly many institutions are not yet diverse at all. So again, continuing issues in higher education. But this kind of historical survey is very much limited by the cultural circumstances in the 19th century. So I do think that in addition to this kind of historical research, I think it's also really important to seek out contemporary voices and voices that represent intersectional experiences and challenges. And we need to listen to the voices of professional librarians, but we also need to listen to our students and their experiences. I think really there's a lot of different voices that we need to elevate as we discuss information literacy instruction, as we discuss these threshold concepts in the new framework. Really need to have a varied set of voices. I do think ultimately everybody has a different take on these threshold concepts. I think some may ring true a little more than others. I think some may be a little more relevant than others. And again, there have been some interesting and valid critiques of threshold concepts as a theory or threshold concepts as applied to information literacy, or the importance of standards in that approach to education. I haven't really gotten into that debate, but it is out there, and I think even if you just search the hashtag ACRL-IL revisions, you'll see a lot of that debate represented from people coming from many different perspectives. What I do like about the new framework, and ultimately I am a fan of it, is that it encourages us to innovate our instruction. It asks us to look past a lot of the kind of mechanical tasks of information retrieval and orienting students to interfaces, which after all change frequently, and it pushes us to engage with students and develop their critical thinking skills, and I think that's very important as an information literacy instructor, and so I think that's a good move for our profession, and I do think that some of the sources that I've talked about today and use examples from echo some of the shift we're going through now in our professional origins. So that wraps up the points that I wanted to make. I certainly welcome any comments or thoughts that others have had, and if any of you have thoughts about how one or more of these threshold concepts might be reflected in the work that you do currently in ways that it did for the 19th century librarians, I'd be interested in hearing that. So are there any questions, any thoughts that people want to add?
Let me, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Okay,
this is Sean Burns. Let me just start off real quick. I just wanted to thank you again for presenting. I also have a bigger comment that you can comment on, and one of the reasons why I wanted to invite you here today was because your presentation, library information science, is very affected by changes in technology, as I think you observed and noted in your presentation, and it's easy to focus on the change, which seems to be a constant, at least throughout the last 140, 50 years. But what you've done here, I think, is kind of help identify the core identity, what stays constant in the profession and its needs and its requirements. And do you have any broader comments about the profession's identity despite all these changes and how that identity seems to remain constant? Thanks.
Well, I personally, I find it a little heartening, and I'm looking at Carolyn's comment that she just made, that it's fascinating and disheartening that so much is the same and unchanged, although I actually, in a lot of ways, I'd like to say that that's what I find heartening. And whether you want to look at it through the idea of threshold concepts or not, the idea that so many of the aspects of our profession, sure, yes, the technology changes and it changes all the time. Dealing with change is something that we as librarians and LIS educators are accustomed to and expect. All those things may change, but these kind of core underlining principles around providing access to information, providing an education in how to access information, the fact that those were constant from now to 125 years ago, I think speaks well of the importance of our profession. And there's so many questions now about the future of libraries, and of course everybody's been at the dinner party where somebody told them that libraries would be gone in 10 years. But the fact that we've undergone all of this technology change, that we've undergone so many different social and cultural shifts over the last 125 years, but the fact that so many of these aspects are consistent over that long period of time, I think really speaks to the importance of our profession and the fact that our profession is ongoing and the work that we're doing is ongoing. And yes, there may be some battles that go on over and over again. When I first found the quote where that I used early in the talk about how librarians are not always seen as educators on their campus, that is something that we still deal with. Perhaps unfortunately, but I do think that there's, I think, a lot of hope that can be found in how constant some of the values of our profession are over a long period of time. Any other questions or comments?
Any other questions? Yeah, about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Susan. Technology is a useful tool, but that's all it is. It's a tool, and we can apply our professional philosophy to the changing circumstances.
Hi, this is Clara. I'll pipe in with a question. So looking at this next iteration of the information literacy standards, what lessons are we taking from the past to examine the current iteration?
I'm not sure how much we are. I think this as a area of research is not one that's been significantly explored. When I started looking for secondary sources on this subject, there were really only a couple I found that went into any great detail about 19th century library instruction. That's not to mean there aren't more sources out there, but in terms of what I could readily get my hands on, and both of which I recommend and are listed on the bibliography that I included here. There's a really amazing, and this made my work so much easier. There was an amazing article written in 1980 by somebody named J.M. Tucker that was essentially a bibliography, an annotated bibliography on articles in library instruction in colleges and universities, and that's what helped me find all the different sources that I used. As I started with that and then found copies and decided on what I wanted to focus on. In terms of Sean's question, yeah, I certainly was focusing on 19th century perspectives compared to what's happening now. Frankly, I don't think I am knowledgeable enough or expert enough to really say something valuable about the history of the standards and how they've been applied. I've only seen my own practice as a professional librarian for the past 5 years, what we do at my university. There are people who are better experts on the subject of the implementation of the standards and research that's been done there that I'd probably refer to. In terms of like how to use the standards, I would say we use the standards at my institution. They form the kind of the backbone of our curriculum map and our information literacy rubric for evaluating student papers. So they're very much tied into the work that we're doing. I'm not really sure that is going to change that substantially with the adoption of the new framework, simply because I think we're going to take a look at the new framework and then tie the types of things that we're looking for when we evaluate student information use and figure out which of the new frames that they relate to and move forward that way rather than kind of ripping up what we do and trying to start over. But again, there's going to be better experts out there on how the standards and use of the standards has evolved over the last 20 years. Anything else? Oh, I'm sorry. I think I missed a question from Sarah, and in terms of assessment and demonstrating value. In terms of comparing then to now, they were certainly fighting a fight to prove their value on their campuses and extend their hours and all sorts of other things. And it's a big topic today, as everyone knows. But that's something that's changed so much. I mean, they didn't do any of the kinds of methods of assessment that are in vogue now, so it's kind of harder to make some of the direct comparisons that I was making for the threshold concepts. As I've mentioned, in terms of my own institution, we use a rubric format for assessing student work, and I feel like that's pretty effective. And for Kelly, I'm certainly interested. I don't know if anyone else is. I have Kelly's contact information. If anybody is interested in something like that, Kelly, feel free to contact me, and I am happy to contact or follow up with anybody who contacts me. So I can be found, my email address is on screen right now, ransom@hnu.edu. I'm also on Twitter at the Panakis. So anybody who's interested in that kind of follow-up, I'm very interested in, and I'll connect with Kelly about that, and you can connect with me. Anything else? All right, thank you all for bearing with me. I realize it was a lot of exposition over the course of 1 hour, and I hope people found it interesting and enjoyable. And thanks again to Sean and Alicia and Clara and everybody who is involved in setting this up and participating.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Alicia, too.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.